In this new year 2022, and if you are one of those who want to try watercolor as a new hobby to get yourself into a creative flow, or you just want to treat it as an art therapy to help you relax, and you wonder how to get started, this is the video for you. In this video, you get to know the essential art supplies you really need to get started. I also show you how to mix color by using only 3 primary colors. I also show you some basic watercolor techniques. And finally, we will practice together by applying all of the techniques and color mixing that we have learned in the previous lesson. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new here. My name is Teresa, and in this channel I do watercolor tutorials and tips and tricks to help you get better with your watercolor skill. And I also do art studio vlog as well. So if this is something that you sound interesting, consider subscribing because I will post new video every Saturday. Okay, now without further ado, let's jump right into the video. First, I want to give you a very quick overview of watercolor. The word watercolor itself is pretty much self-explanatory. Watercolor is the water-based medium in which you will need to use water to activate the paint in order to use it. Because of that, it is easy to mix, easy to blend, and also dries very fast. Watercolor is transparent. Therefore, when using watercolor, it can help you achieve a soft, gradient, and delicate look for your painting. However, at the same time, it's also considered as one of the medium that is hard to control and can be unpredictable. This can sound a little bit intimidating to a lot of people, including me, but I also personally think that it is a great medium to help us let go of perfection and just enjoy the process. But I promise when you get a hang of it, it will help you to capture pretty much everything you can imagine in your head. Landscape, seascape, flowers, trees, still life. No matter what style you pursue, realism, abstract, or expressionism, the sky is your limit. And last but not least, watercolor is such an accessible medium for everyone, especially for beginners who want to learn how to paint. Compared to other mediums, watercolor requires such a very minimum setup, which leads me to the second part that I will show you all the basic supply you will need to get started. Here are a couple of things you will need: paints, paper, couple of brushes, 1 or 2 cups of water, and kitchen towel or a piece of cloth. Among these, pens, paper, and brushes are the essential items. I will go in more detail in the next part. I will start with paper since this is the most important among the 3. First, because of the nature of watercolor paint, you will need to use the paper that is made specifically for watercolor. As you can see, on the left side, I have Canson XL, which is the student grade watercolor paper. And on the right side, I have Archie's, which is considered as artist grade. For student grade, the brush is affordable price and is a good option for a beginner who just started out and want to do a lot of practice. But for the cons, this is a student grade, so it is not made from 100% cotton, so the quality is not the best. And for the artist grade paper, the brush is made from 100% cotton paper, so it provides the best quality. Therefore, this type of paper is widely used by most of professional artists. And the con is it can be very expensive. I started out with Canson XL, and up to now I've been using this paper for when I need to do some practice, like some sketches, some color swatching, or just some art therapy, and I find it is a good option for beginners. But when I need to do some advanced painting that require a lot of techniques, then I go for arches. These two paper they both cold press. In watercolor paper, we have cold press and hot press. So cold press basically is just the paper that has texture, as you can see on the screen. I personally use cold press most of the time because I can take advantage of its texture to apply the dry brush technique, which helped me achieve certain effect and a very unique brush mark. Hot press paper is completely opposite to cold press. It has no texture and the surface is completely smooth. I don't find myself reaching for hot press paper very often, but what doesn't work for me doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't work for you either. So I highly recommend that you try out different paper and see what works best for you and start from there. But overall, here's a couple things that you need to consider when looking for a new watercolor paper. Make sure that the packaging says watercolor, and 140 pounds is the common weight for any watercolor paper. And make sure you look for either cold press or hot press, as always mentioned in the packaging. And finally, you will want to know if this paper is 100% cotton or not. And this is the information that you can always look for in the packaging as well. Most of the time, they will mention if the paper is made from 100% cotton. But if you cannot find that information, it's likely that the paper is student grade and is not made with 100% cotton. Next, we talk about brushes. You don't really need a huge collection of brushes to start. 1 or 2 brushes is good enough. I find myself reaching for a round brush most of the time because this is versatile and easy to use. You can use the tip of the brush to paint small detail and use the barrier of the brush to make the big brushstroke or cover a large area. I also have a flat brush, which can be very useful in some of the landscape painting. Princeton is one of the great brands for brushes. I've been using their brushes since the beginning of my art journey, and the price is quite affordable too. For paint as a beginner and for you to not break the bank, you don't really need a fancy and expensive watercolor paint to start. There's a lot of great student-grade watercolor paint in the market for you to choose from. Winsor & Newton Cotman is one of them. I've been using them since the beginning of my watercolor journey, and I'm still using them now. They are good quality and it is a great option for beginners. Here's the fact, you don't really need a tons of color to start with. Only these 3 colors, red, blue, yellow, can help you mix into different colors that you can imagine in your head and create your own palette. And beside these 3 primary colors, I would love to add paint grays as a replacement for black, and a tube whitewash is also a good add-in option. I want to show you how to activate the pens if this is the very first time you use watercolor. First, I would like to use my water spray to re-wet the paint because watercolor paints is very easy to dry. And after that, I pick up my brush, dip into the water, and dab into my cloth to remove the excess water. And after that, I just dip into the color pens that I want to use and pick up the pens from there. Next, I will put the colors on the mixing area in the palette. And now I start applying the pens onto the paper. One of the questions that is commonly asked in watercolor is that how much water to add. Well, I don't think that there's any specific answer for that question, but there's only one thing I want you to remember is that in watercolor, the more water you add into the paint, the pigment will get lighter. And the less water you use, the more saturated the color will appear on the paper. And to make it easier for you, I also have a quick demonstration here on the paper. As you can see, the first blue is the darkest one since I add a very little water. But as I add more water into the pigment, you can see that the color appears to be lighter. I will do again with red and this time you can see it more obviously. So how much water to use really depends on how much saturated you want the color to be. But don't worry if it appears to be too light, because in watercolor you usually work from light to dark, and if it's too light you can always add more layers to build up the color intensity. And one more tip I want to provide you guys, as you can see I still have a lot of pens here on my mixing area. And one of the great things about watercolor is that you can always re-wet the dry pens with water and then you're good to go. So the next time if you still have a lot of paint on your palette, don't clean it up. Just leave it there for it to dry, and the next time when you use it, you can always re-wet with water. And at the same time, watercolor is very easy to clean. I just need to grab my towel, wipe it up, and then I will have more space for my mixing. And next, we will practice on how to mix color from the three primaries. Here I have ultramarine, cadmium red, and lemon yellow. Feel free to use any blue, red, and yellow that you have available at your. Since I already have lemon yellow on the mixing area, I will mix it with ultramarine. And for blue mixing with yellow, we have green. And if I add more yellow into this green mixture, I will have another green, which is slightly different from the first one. This is the yellow green since we have more yellow into the mixture. And if I go back and add more ultramarine blue into the same mixture, as you can see, I will have a very cool bluish green. So as you can see, with only two colors, blue and yellow, and by using different ratio each time, we already have 3 different shades of greens. Isn't that amazing? Next, I will try to make violet by mixing blue and red and using the same process as I did with blue and yellow. And as you can see, first I have a neutral toned violet by mixing the same amount of blue and red. And for the next one, you see that I add more red into the mixture, so I have a very warm reddish violet kind of shade. And finally, by adding more blue into the mixture, I have this very cool purple, bluish purple. And now we have created 6 different colors. And finally, I will mix red with yellows and it will give me orange. And finally, we actually have created totally 9 colors from only mixing 3 primaries together. And not to mention, if you depends on how much water you each into of these colors, you can also have a different shade and value. I think this is such a great exercise for beginners. And it is very important for you to know how to mix color as well. And I hope that you can also do this exercise along with me when you watch this video. And in case you have a palette of more than 3 primaries, you can also swatch all colors that you have in your palette and try to mix some of them together to see what kind of colors you can achieve. You can only expose and discover the colors you love by experimenting with mixing. Color mixing and color swatching is a fun exercise for beginners, especially when you don't know what to paint. Next, I will show you some of the basic techniques that you most likely will use a lot in most of the watercolor paintings. And the first two is wet on wet and wet on dry. You probably hear a lot if you ever watch some of my watercolor tutorials. Wet on wet technique is when you apply wet paint onto a wet paper. Here you see that I am applying a wet layer of water onto the paper first, and after that I pick up some of the colors and start applying onto the wet area. And as you can see, since the surface still wet, when you apply the color, it's gonna spread automatically. This technique will give you a very soft and delicate look. I often use this technique when I need to paint the gradient sky. And for wet on dry, you basically just use wet paint onto a dry surface, just like what I am demonstrating here. And for this technique, it can be used when you need more control or when you want to add detail. As you can see, opposite to the wet on wet, the paint doesn't spread because the surface is not wet. And for this technique, sometimes it can leave a very harsh line. And as I mentioned in the earlier part, it depends on the water, how much water you put into the paint, that it will appear to be more saturated or less saturated. And here for wet on dry, since the surface is dry, that means less water adding into the paint. So you can see the colors look more saturated compared to the wet on wet side. And here we have wet on wet and wet on dry technique. And next, I want to show you two more techniques that I often use in my painting as well. They are mixing on palette and mixing on paper. For mixing on palette, this is quite simple. It's just like how we mix colors in the color mixing part. So to make a color, you just mix two colors onto the palette and after that apply onto the paper. But for mixing on paper, that means when you mix two colors directly on the paper. And for this technique, you will have to combine it with the wet on wet techniques, which you will need to wet the paper first and after that apply the two colors you want to mix on the wet area. And as you can see, the mixing on palettes, you have the colors which is pretty uniform, but on mixing on paper, when you mix two colors on the paper, you have a different variety. You can see the red, the blue, and also have the purple where the two colors mix together. There is no techniques better than the others. It's just different techniques gonna give you a different result, and it depends on what kind of looks you want to achieve for your painting, and you will use the techniques that help you to achieve that look accordingly. And the next part, I want to show you how to incorporate these techniques into your painting by doing two exercises. The first one, we'll do a mini little landscape, and after that we practice some brush strokes by painting some leaves and flowers. For the first exercise, I am using a small piece of watercolor paper. This is Canson XL. Feel free to use any watercolor paper that you have at your home. And I highly recommend that you start with a small size of painting since you are beginners, and just don't overwhelm yourself. You can tape down the paper by using a masking tape, just like what I am doing here, or you don't have to. This is totally optional. To demonstrate this mini landscape, I am going to use my flat brush. Feel free to use whatever brush that you prefer. For colors, I am going to put all the name of the colors on the screen for your reference, but you can either use the colors that's similar to mine, or you just use any color of your choice, whatever you prefer. First, I will paint the sky, and for the sky, I will use the wet on wet technique. And as you can see, I start by wetting the paper by clean water. Make sure that you don't apply too much water. You know the paper is good when it has a shiny surface. And now I start picking up the colors from the palettes and start applying onto the paper. Now my first layer is done and completely dry. As you can see, the color is still very light, and that is one thing about watercolors. When it dries, it tends to get lighter than it looks when it's still wet. And to build up the color intensity, I will go back and apply another layer of water to re-wet the paper first and continue applying the color onto the paper. And you will keep repeating the same process until you feel satisfied with the colors. Next, I am going to apply wet on dry technique to paint the mountains. And for this technique, make sure that you wait until the first layer is completely dry before continuing with your painting. And to paint the mountain, I am using the pre-made purple that I already have in my palette and mixing with a little bit of permanent rose. And I also add the water into the mixture to make it lighter, because this is the first layer of mountains. I don't want it to be too dark. Next, I wanted to add some kind of shadow for the mountains using wet on dry techniques. And for this one, make sure that the layer of the mountains is completely dry. And then I go back with the same mixture of purple and permanent rose and added the colors, another layer on one side of the mountain, just like what you're seeing here. Next, I want to add one more mountain onto the left side. So for this one, I will go back to my palette, pick up the purple, but this time we'll add just a little bit of water to have the colors has the most saturated, and start painting. I also added a shadow for this mountain as well by adding another layer of purple on the right side, as you can see here. Now I feel like the left side of the mountain is a little bit too dark and it's hard to distinguish between the shadow. So I just go back with my clean damp brush and try to lift up some of the color on the left side, as you can see. And now it appears to be lighter compared to the right side. And now when you look at the mountain, you can tell where is the light and where is the shadow. And now I also use the same color, which is the purple, in the most saturated form by adding the minimum amount of water and start painting some birds into the sky to add some movement for my painting. And finally, to finish up, I am using whitewash to add moon for my painting. You can skip this part if you don't have wash, but as I say in the beginning, having a tube of whitewash is such a great add-in option. You can actually incorporate wash into your painting in many different ways. And finally, the painting is done. I'm going to remove the tape, and if you also taped out the paper like me, in order to avoid tearing the paper, you can just pull the tape away from the paper and just slowly remove it, and by that way you can reserve the paper in a perfect form. The painting is done. I think this painting is simple enough for beginner to start, and also at the same time you can also see how I apply all of the techniques that we have learned so far to create this painting as well. And for the next and also the final exercise, I want you to pick up your round brush and together we will practice some brush strokes. First, you can pick up any color of your choice. And now make sure that you observe carefully how I use the brush to apply the color. As I mentioned earlier, for round brush, you can use the tip of your brush to create a small and fine detail, and for the belly, you can actually make a bigger brush strokes. So try to practice that with your brow brush. First, you're gonna use the tip of your brush for the line, and after that push the belly of the brush onto the paper so that you can have a bigger brush strokes. And with these brush strokes, you actually are painting leaves. This brush stroke can be seen and used a lot in botanical painting for flowers and leaves. And as you can see, just keep painting until you feel comfortable to make these brush strokes. And now if you combine two of these brush strokes together, you actually have another shape of leaf. So we have one brushstroke leaf and two brushstroke leaf. I really love doing this type of exercise. Not only it helps you to get used to the brush and making different brush strokes, but it's also help you to relax as well. And now I'm just gonna continue the practice with painting some flowers. And also remember that this exercise is meant for you to get to know your brush, to explore how many brush strokes you can make, and to observe and see how different colors interact with each other on the paper. It doesn't mean for you to create a perfect painting whatsoever. So don't stress too much about the outcome, but rather just focus and enjoy the process. Next, I highly suggest that you check out my watercolor supplies for beginner if you want to know more about the supplies, or when you're ready for tutorials. I also have a playlist that you can learn how to paint in watercolor, either landscape or florals. And I will link everything in the description below. Hi guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video provided you a lot of helpful information so that you can get started right away with your watercolor in this new year. And if you like this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up, because that is the only way to get YouTube know and recommend this video for other people as well. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so that you can see more videos like this in the future. And I will see you in my next one. Have a good day. Bye.